My billionaire brother didn't just abandon us when he got rich. He secretly used our childhood home as collateral for a debt that's now at our front door. I thought he came home for a second chance, but he actually brought a death sentence to the only sanctuary we had left. Blood is supposed to be thicker than water, but in my family, blood was more like a contract that my brother, Julian, decided to breach the moment he saw a comma in his bank account. We grew up in a house where everything was shared: the last slice of bread, the hand-me-down sneakers, and the quiet dreams of one day escaping the suffocating humidity of our small town. Julian was the golden boy, the one with the sharp mind for numbers and a silver tongue that could talk a stray dog into giving up its bone. I was the steady one, the one who stayed behind to help Dad with his failing knees and Mom with her fading memory. We were a team, or so I thought, until the day Julian's tech startup secured its first 8-figure investment. The transformation wasn't gradual. It was like a light switch had been flipped. One day, he was calling me to ask for $50 to cover his rent, and the next, he was posting photos from a rooftop bar in Manhattan, draped in Italian silk and surrounded by people who looked like they'd never seen a day of manual labor in their lives. At first, we were happy for him. We sent him congratulatory texts, called him to hear the excitement in his voice, and waited for him to visit during the holidays. But the calls went to voicemail. The text remained on read. The visits never happened. It started with small excuses. "I'm in the middle of a merger, Mark. I'll call you back." Then it shifted to, "I can't make it for Thanksgiving. The markets are too volatile." By the third year, the excuses stopped entirely. It was as if we had ceased to exist. I watched through a screen as my brother became a visionary, a disruptor, a titan of industry. He was all over LinkedIn and Forbes, talking about how he built his empire from nothing through pure grit and independence. He conveniently forgot to mention the years Mom spent working double shifts at the diner to pay for his coding boot camp, or the time Dad sold his vintage truck, his pride and joy, just so Julian could afford his first high-end laptop. He didn't build it from nothing. He built it on our backs, and then he used those same backs as a stepping stone to climb into a world where we weren't invited. The silence was the hardest part. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, agonizing erosion of connection. Mom would sit by the window every Sunday, her phone clutched in her hand like a rosary, waiting for a call that never came. "He's just busy, Mark," she'd tell me, her voice trembling with a hope that made my chest ache. "He's doing big things. He'll call when he has a moment." But the moments turned into months, and the months turned into years. When Dad had his first heart attack, I called Julian 37 times in 2 hours. I left messages, sent emails, even reached out to his assistant. I got a response 3 days later, not from Julian, but from a junior PR associate, saying that Mr. Sterling was currently out of the country on a retreat and would be informed of the family matter upon his return. He never called. He sent a generic get-well flower arrangement that looked like it had been ordered from a supermarket catalog. Dad didn't even look at them. He just turned his head to the wall and sighed. I stopped trying after that. I blocked his social media, stopped reading the tech blogs, and focused on the life I had. I took over the family's modest landscaping business, worked until my knuckles were raw, and made sure our parents were taken care of. We learned to live with the Julian-sized hole in our lives. We stopped mentioning his name at dinner. We packed away his old trophies and photos into the attic, letting the dust settle over the memory of the brother I once knew. I moved on. I had to. You can only mourn someone who is still alive for so long before it starts to poison your own spirit. 5 years passed. 5 years of absolute chilling silence. Our lives had found a new, quieter rhythm. Mom's dementia had progressed, and she no longer asked why Julian wasn't there. In fact, on her bad days, she didn't even remember she had a second son. It was a mercy, in a way. I had just finished a long day of work, my boots caked in mud and my back screaming for a hot shower, when my phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. It was a private number. Usually I'd ignore it, thinking it was just another telemarketer or a collection agency looking for the previous tenant. But something about the persistence of the ring felt different. It felt heavy. I picked it up on the fourth ring, not saying a word. "Mark?" The voice was thin, ragged, and stripped of the polished arrogance I remembered from his televised interviews. It sounded like someone who had been screaming into a void for a very long time. It took me a second to register that it was him, Julian. My heart didn't leap with joy. It hardened into a cold, jagged stone in my chest. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice as flat as the horizon. "Mark, it's me. It's Julian. Please, don't hang up." I leaned against the counter, staring at a crack in the linoleum floor. "Julian? I don't know a Julian. I had a brother once, but he died about 5 years ago, or maybe he just evaporated. I can't quite remember." "I deserve that," he choked out. I could hear him shivering through the receiver. "I deserve everything you have to say to me. But Mark, I'm in trouble. I'm in real, serious trouble. Everything is gone. The company, the accounts, the house. It's all gone. The board ousted me. The feds are looking into the venture capital shifts, and my friends, they disappeared the second the stock plummeted. I have nowhere to go. I'm at a bus station in Newark, and I don't even have enough for a ticket home." The irony was so thick I could almost taste it. The titan of industry, the disruptor, the man who was too busy for his father's heart surgery, was now begging for a bus ticket from the brother he'd treated like a ghost. I felt a surge of cold, dark satisfaction, followed immediately by a wave of exhaustion. "Why are you calling me, Julian?" I asked. "You told the world you built your life with pure independence. Go be independent. Use some of that grit you talked about on the news." "Mark, please," he sobbed. It was a pathetic, wet sound that made my skin crawl. "I haven't eaten in 2 days. I'm scared. I think people are following me. I just need a place to hide for a few weeks until I can figure this out. I'm your brother." "You were my brother," I corrected him. "Now you're just a stranger who's interrupting my dinner. Goodbye, Julian." I reached for the end call button, my finger hovering over the red icon, feeling a sense of finality I'd waited years for. But then, he said something that stopped my heart cold. "Wait, Mark, it's not just the money. There's something else, something I did back then. Something about Dad's medical bills that I never told you about. If they find me, they're going to come for you too, and they're going to take the house." The word house hit me like a physical blow. That house wasn't just a structure of wood and mortar. It was the only thing we had left. It was the place where Dad had carved our heights into the kitchen doorframe, where Mom still sat in her favorite armchair, lost in the fog of her own mind but safe in a sanctuary she recognized. To me, that house was a fortress. To hear Julian use it as a bargaining chip, or worse, a casualty of his own greed, sent a surge of adrenaline through my veins that tasted like copper. "What did you do, Julian?" I whispered, my voice shaking with a fury I could barely contain. "What did you do to the house?" "I didn't have a choice," he stammered, his words tripping over each other. "A year ago, when the first round of lawsuits hit, I needed liquid capital. I needed to show the board I had skin in the game. I found the old paperwork from when Dad was in the hospital, the power of attorney he signed over to me when he thought he was dying. I used it to take out a secondary loan. I thought I'd pay it back in a month. I swear, Mark, I thought the IPO would cover everything tenfold." The room seemed to tilt. I looked around the kitchen. The humming refrigerator, the stack of bills I'd meticulously paid on time, the smell of the pine cleaner I'd used that morning. It was all a lie. My brother had reached back from his high-tower life and placed a noose around our necks without us even knowing. "You leveraged the roof over Mom's head to save your failing ego?" I felt a roar building in my chest. "You stayed silent for 5 years, didn't show up for his funeral, didn't help with a single cent of her care, and all the while you were using us as a safety net for your gambling?" "It wasn't gambling, it was business," he shrieked, a flash of his old arrogance flickering before dying out. And it's not just a bank loan, Mark. I had to go elsewhere for the rest. Private lenders. People who don't care about foreclosure notices or grace periods. They've been tracking my phone. That's why I threw it away. I'm calling from a burner. If they find me and they realize I don't have the money, they'll come for the assets. They'll come for the house. And they're not the type to wait for an eviction notice. I wanted to tell him to rot. I wanted to hang up and let whatever monsters he'd conjured find him in that Newark bus station. But he had the house tied to his neck, and Mom was inside it. I couldn't protect her if I didn't know what we were facing. "Stay exactly where you are," I said, my voice cold and hollow. "Don't move. Don't talk to anyone. I'm coming to get you, not because I forgive you and not because I want to help you, but because you're going to tell me exactly how to untie this knot before I kick you out into the street myself." The drive to Newark was a 3-hour descent into a personal hell. Every mile of highway felt like a betrayal. I thought about Dad's truck, the one he'd sold for Julian. I thought about the way Dad's hands used to shake at the end of his life, and how he never complained because he thought his son was out there making something of himself. If he had known that the very son he sacrificed for was the one who would eventually sign away his legacy, it would have killed him faster than the heart disease ever could. The bus station was a bleak, fluorescent-lit purgatory. It smelled of stale coffee, diesel fumes, and the kind of deep-seated despair that clings to the walls. I spotted Julian in the corner, huddled on a plastic bench. He looked nothing like the man in the magazines. He was wearing a salt-stained designer overcoat that was missing buttons, his hair was matted, and his eyes were sunken and bloodshot. He looked like a ghost that had forgotten how to haunt. When he saw me, he stood up, his legs wobbling. For a second, I saw the little boy who used to follow me into the woods, the one who cried when he scraped his knee. But then I remembered the junior PR associate and the get well flowers, and the softness in me turned to flint. "Get in the truck," I said before he could even open his mouth. I didn't speak to him for the first hour of the drive back. He tried to start several times. "Mark, I'm so sorry. Mark, you have no idea what it was like," but I just turned the radio up until the static drowned him out. I didn't want his apologies. They were worthless currency. I wanted information. "The private lenders," I finally said as we crossed the county line. "Who are they, Julian, and how much is the debt?" Julian swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the silence of the cab. "His name is Elias Thorne. He's not a banker. He's a distressed asset specialist. That's what he calls himself. In reality, he's a predator. He buys up debts that are impossible to pay and then uses whatever means necessary to collect. I owe him $400,000, but with the interest he tacked on for the late payments, it's closer to $700,000. I nearly swerved into the guardrail. $700,000? Julian, the house is barely worth $300,000 on a good day. Why would he even take that as collateral? Julian looked out the window, his reflection trembling in the glass. Because he knew I'd be desperate. And he knew that if I couldn't pay, the property sits on a plot of land that's recently been rezoned for commercial development. He doesn't want the house, Mark. He wants the dirt it's sitting on. He's been waiting for me to fail. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a bad business deal. This was a targeted hit. Our home, our memories, Mom's entire world was just a distressed asset to a man I'd never heard of. "We have to go to the police," I said. "If he's threatening you, if this loan was predatory—" "No," Julian shouted, jumping in his seat. "No police, you don't understand. Thorne has people everywhere. If the feds get involved, my entire bankruptcy fraud case blows up and I go to prison for 20 years. And Thorne, he doesn't use lawyers to settle scores. He'll burn the house down with us inside it before he lets the state take his collateral." We pulled into our driveway as the sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the lawn. The house looked so peaceful, so unaware of the vultures circling above it. I looked at the porch light. the one I'd replaced last week, and felt a crushing weight on my chest. "Go inside," I told Julian. "Keep the curtains closed. Don't tell Mom who you are if she's having a bad day. I need to think." I watched him shuffle toward the door, a broken man carrying a suitcase full of ruin. I stayed in the truck for a moment, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I needed a plan. I needed a way to fight a man like Thorne with nothing but a landscaping business and a brother I couldn't trust. I stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching under my boots. That's when I noticed it. Parked at the end of our long dirt driveway, obscured by the overgrown hedges of the neighbor's property, was a sleek, black SUV. The engine was off, but the windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see who was inside. It hadn't been there when I left. As I stood there, frozen, the driver's side window rolled down just an inch. A thin plume of cigarette smoke drifted out into the cool morning air, and a pale, scarred hand flicked an ash onto the ground. Then, the window rolled back up, and the car slowly, silently began to roll forward, creeping toward the house like a predator that had finally found its prey's den. The black SUV didn't accelerate. It didn't screech its tires or attempt to ram the porch. It simply crawled, the tires crunching over the gravel with a slow, rhythmic precision that felt like a countdown. It stopped exactly where my property line met the main road, its nose pointed directly at my front door. It sat there, idling, a silent, heavy shadow against the graying dawn. I didn't go inside immediately. I stood my ground, my hands balled into fists at my sides, trying to project a courage I didn't feel. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I wanted them to see me. I wanted them to know that this wasn't Julian's polished corporate world. This was my dirt, my life, and I wasn't going to let them roll over it without a fight. After a minute of agonizing stillness, the SUV's lights flickered once, high beams that blinded me for a split second, and then it reversed, disappearing back into the morning mist as quietly as it had arrived. A warning. They were showing me they knew exactly where we were. I burst into the house, slamming the door and throwing the heavy deadbolt. Julian was standing in the middle of the living room, looking around like he had stepped into a museum of a life he'd long since forgotten. He was staring at a framed photo of us from 15 years ago, back when we were just two kids with sun-bleached hair and a fishing pole between us. "Don't touch anything," I snapped, my voice sharp enough to draw blood, "and stay away from the windows." "Mark, Shut up, Julian. Just shut up." I marched over to the kitchen sink and splashed cold water on my face, trying to stop the world from spinning. The black SUV. Was that Thorne's people? Julian nodded slowly, his face ashen. "He has teams in every major city. I thought I lost them in Philly. I switched buses 3 times. I didn't think—" "You didn't think. That's been your brand for 5 years, hasn't it?" I turned on him, my finger inches from his nose. "You brought a death sentence to our front door. You told me you used Dad's power of attorney. What did you actually sign, Julian? I want the truth, every single word of it." He sank into a kitchen chair, the same one Dad used to sit in while he read the Sunday paper. He looked so small in it, so diminished. "It wasn't just a loan, it was a transfer of interest agreement. I leveraged the deed as a guarantee for a high-interest bridge loan. But Thorne, he didn't just have me sign for the money. He had me sign a clause that says if the debt isn't settled in full by the end of this month, the title automatically transfers to his holding company. No court, no foreclosure process, just a straight swap." "That's not legal," I hissed. "You can't just swap a deed like that without both owners' consent. My name is on the secondary title since Dad passed." Julian looked at his shoes, and a cold dread began to pool in my stomach. "Julian," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "look at me." He raised his head, his eyes brimming with tears. "I forged it, Mark. I had your signature from the old landscaping contracts we used to share. I scanned it. I made it look perfect. I was so sure the company would bounce back. I was going to shred the paperwork before you ever found out. I was going to be the hero who saved the family with a surprise inheritance. I felt the air leave my lungs. He hadn't just risked the house. He had committed a felony using my name. He had tied me to his sinking ship with a knot I couldn't untie without sending my own brother to prison, or losing everything I had worked for. "You're a monster," I whispered. "I'm a failure," he sobbed, burying his face in his hands. "There's a difference. Not from where I'm standing." Before I could say another word, a soft, shuffling sound came from the hallway. We both froze. Mom appeared in the doorway, clutching her worn bathrobe around her thin frame. She looked at me. Then her gaze drifted to the broken man sobbing at the kitchen table. She squinted, her brow furrowing in that way that meant she was fighting through the fog. "Mark?" she asked softly. "Who is this man? Is he here about the lawn?" Julian let out a ragged, choked-off gasp. He looked up at her, his face a mask of agony. "Mom, it's me. It's Julian." She blinked, a small, polite smile touching her lips, the kind of smile you give a stranger at the grocery store. "Julian? That's a lovely name. My son has a name like that, but he's in New York. He's very important, you know. He's going to buy me a house with a garden that never wilts." Julian broke then. He truly broke. He fell to his knees on the linoleum, his forehead resting on the floor, and wailed. It was the sound of a man realizing that the world he'd built was made of ash, and the people he'd left behind had already moved on to a place where he was no longer a person, but a fading memory. Mom looked at me, confused and slightly frightened. "Why is he crying, Mark? Did he lose something?" "Yes, Mom," I said, stepping forward to lead her back to her room. "He lost everything. Go back to sleep. It's just a bad dream." I got her settled back into bed, her breathing evening out as she slipped back into the merciful oblivion of her condition. When I returned to the kitchen, Julian was sitting back in the chair, his eyes red, but his expression strangely vacant. "We have to go," he said. "If we leave now, if we give them the house, maybe they'll leave you and Mom alone. I'll go to the feds. I'll confess to everything, the forgery, the fraud, and I'll tell them you had no part in it. It might buy you time." "And go where, Julian? Put Mom in a state-run facility? Live out of my truck?" I shook my head. "No, this is our home. Dad's buried in the cemetery 2 miles from here. I am not moving." "You don't have a choice." Julian grabbed my arm, his grip desperate. "Thorne doesn't just want the land, Mark. He needs to make an example of me. My company didn't just fail, it collapsed because I blew the whistle on some of his other investments when I realized who he really was. He's not just a debt collector. He's a shark, and I'm the blood in the water. If you stay here, you're just part of the meal." I pushed him away, walking over to the window. I eased the curtain back just a fraction of an inch. The sun was up now, casting a pale, weak light over the yard. The black SUV was gone, but something else caught my eye. There was a man standing at the edge of the woods, right where the property line met the old oak grove. He was wearing a high-visibility vest and holding a surveyor's transit. He wasn't even hiding. He was calmly marking stakes into the ground, my ground. "They're already surveying," I said, a cold chill running down my spine. "They're not waiting for the end of the month." I turned back to Julian, ready to tell him we were going to the police regardless of the consequences, when my phone on the counter chirped. It was a text from an unknown number. I picked it up, my thumb trembling as I swiped the screen. It was a photo. It was a picture taken from outside, looking through the kitchen window. It showed Julian on his knees, crying, and me standing over him. But that wasn't the terrifying part. The terrifying part was the second photo that followed immediately after. It was a picture of Mom, sleeping in her bed, taken from inside the hallway just minutes ago. The caption read, "The garden is beautiful, Mark. It would be a shame to see it wilt so soon. We're coming in for coffee in 10 minutes. Make sure the front door is unlocked." The air in the kitchen turned to ice. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. My eyes were locked on the image of Mom, sleeping peacefully in the room just 20 feet away while some shadow had stood over her with a camera. The violation was total. It wasn't just that they were coming for the house anymore. They had already breached the sanctuary. They had shown me that her life was a light switch they could flip at any moment. "They're inside," I whispered, the words barely finding their way past my throat. Julian's head snapped up. "What?" I shoved the phone into his face. He looked at the photo of Mom, then at the text, and his entire body began to shake so violently that his teeth literally chattered. No, no, no. I didn't think they'd move this fast. I thought they'd at least wait for the paperwork to clear. "Julian, get up." I grabbed him by the collar of his expensive tattered coat and hauled him to his feet. My panic had been replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. It was the survival instinct that comes when you realize there's no more room to run. "Get Mom, now. Take her to the basement. There's a crawl space behind the old freezer. Get her in there and don't make a sound. If you hear anything at all, you stay put." "What are you going to do?" he gasped, his eyes wide and wild. "I'm going to put the coffee on," I said, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. I didn't wait for him to move. I shoved him toward the hallway and turned toward the counter. My hands were steady as I filled the glass pot with water. I scooped the grounds into the filter with rhythmic precision. I needed to be the man who owned this house, not the victim they expected. I went to the knife block, pulled out the heavy cleaver I use for butchering, and tucked it into the waistband of my jeans at the small of my back, hidden by my flannel shirt. I heard Julian's frantic whispers in the hallway, then the soft, confused protests of my mother as he led her toward the basement stairs. "Where are we going, Julian? Is it time for the garden?" Her voice broke my heart, but I forced it down. I couldn't afford a heart right now. I heard the basement door click shut. Silence fell over the house, heavy and suffocating. Exactly 10 minutes later, the gravel outside groaned under the weight of tires. I didn't look out the window. I stood by the stove, watching the dark liquid drip into the pot. The scent of roasted beans filled the kitchen, a domestic smell that felt grotesque given the circumstances. There was no knock. The front door handle turned, the deadbolt I had locked minutes ago sliding back with a sickeningly smooth thud. They had a key. Of course they did. Julian had probably given them everything without even realizing it. 2 men stepped into the kitchen. The first was a mountain of a man in a charcoal suit, his face a map of old scars and indifference. He didn't look like a thug. He looked like a professional mover, the kind who cleared out estates after the owners had died. He stayed by the door, hands folded in front of him. The second man was different. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, wearing a beige cashmere coat and spectacles that caught the kitchen light. He looked like a university professor or a high-end architect. He offered a small, thin-lipped smile as he pulled out a chair, the one Julian had just been sitting in, and sat down. "Mark," he said, his voice a smooth, melodic baritone. "I'm Silas. I represent Mr. Thorne. Thank you for the coffee. It smells excellent." I didn't move from the stove. "You were in my mother's room." Silas waved a hand dismissively, as if I were bringing up a minor social faux pas. "A security check. We needed to ensure that Julian hadn't brought any unwanted guests into this transaction. He has a habit of being dishonest, as you've recently discovered." "The transaction is over," I said, my voice level. "My brother forged my signature. The deed transfer is illegal. I'll be calling the police the moment you leave." Silas chuckled, a dry, dusty sound. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a manila envelope, laying it on the table. "Mark, let's not be tedious. We know the signature is a forgery. In fact, we counted on it. It's much easier to leverage a man who is terrified of a prison sentence than one who is merely broke." He tapped the envelope. "Inside this, you'll find the original documents Julian signed, but you'll also find something else. You'll find a series of wire transfer receipts. Over the last 3 years, Julian didn't just ignore your calls. He used this property, your family's name, to launder nearly $2 million in offshore consulting fees for a shell company Thorn owns. If you go to the police, you aren't just reporting a forgery. You're reporting a massive multi-state money laundering operation that has your name and this address stamped all over it. I felt the floor drop away. Julian hadn't just put a lien on the house. He had turned our home into a crime scene. I didn't sign anything, I rasped. The IRS won't care, Silas replied smoothly. By the time the forensic accountants are done, you'll be 60 years old before you see the sun again. And your mother, well, the state isn't particularly kind to the parents of felons with no assets left. He leaned forward, his eyes turning cold behind his glasses. We don't want you, Mark. We don't even want the land anymore. The rezoning deal fell through yesterday. The property is practically worthless to Mr. Thorn now. I blinked, confused. Then why are you here? If the land is worthless, take Julian and leave us alone. Silas smiled again, and this time it was the smile of a shark. Because Julian lied to us about one more thing. He didn't just lose Thorn's money, he stole something on his way out of the company, a hardware drive, an encrypted insurance policy that contains the personal data and banking routing numbers of every one of Thorn's high net worth associates. My head whipped toward the basement door. Julian, that sniveling, pathetic coward, hadn't come home for help. He had come here to hide his loot. We know he has it, Silas continued, and we know he's in this house. Give us the drive and we'll burn these papers. We'll leave the house to you, free and clear. We'll even give you a modest relocation fee for your mother's care. But if you don't... He nodded toward the man by the door. The large man reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, silenced pistol. He didn't point it at me. He pointed it at the floor, directly above where the basement crawlspace was located. I'll give you 5 minutes to bring your brother and the drive up here, Silas said, checking his watch. If you don't, we start shooting through the floorboards. We'll find the drive eventually. It just depends on how much blood we have to mop up first. I looked at the clock on the wall. The second hand was ticking with agonizing slowness. My mind raced. I had to get to Julian. I had to get that drive. But as I turned toward the basement door, a loud, crashing sound echoed from below. It wasn't the sound of a struggle. It was the sound of the heavy freezer being shoved aside. A moment later, Julian's voice screamed out from the vents, but it wasn't a plea for help. It was a roar of betrayal. I don't have it, Mark. They're lying. I gave it to Dad before he died. It's in the walls. They're going to kill us anyway. Silas's expression shifted from calm to murderous. He signaled the man with the gun. But before the first shot could ring out, the back door of the kitchen exploded inward, and a flashbang grenade bounced across the linoleum, blinding the room in a searing white light. The world turned into a screaming white void. The flashbang didn't just blind me, it felt like it shoved a red-hot needle through my eardrums. I collapsed against the counter, the heavy cleaver slipping from my hand as I clawed at my eyes. Through the ringing in my head, I heard the muffled thud, thud, thud of a tactical entry, boots hitting the floor, the metallic clatter of equipment, and voices shouting commands that sounded like they were coming from underwater. I felt a pair of strong hands shove me to the floor. "Stay down, federal agents! Keep your hands visible!" I pressed my face into the linoleum, the smell of pine cleaner and burnt magnesium filling my nose. My vision began to return in jagged, blurry patches. I saw Silas's mountain of a man face down near the refrigerator, a red dot from a laser sight dancing on the back of his head. Silas himself was pinned against the kitchen table, his glasses skewed and his expensive cashmere coat hiked up as he was handcuffed with brutal efficiency. "Clear!" someone shouted. "We have 2 more in the basement," I yelled, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. "My mother, she's in the basement. Don't shoot, she's sick." An agent in a tactical vest, the word FBI emblazoned across his chest in bold yellow letters, hovered over me. "We know, Mr. Sterling. Stay where you are." Minutes felt like hours. I watched as they hauled Silas and his henchmen out of the house. Silas didn't look like a professor anymore. He looked like a cornered rat, his face twisted in a silent snarl. Then I heard the basement door creak open. 2 agents led my mother up the stairs. She was trembling, her eyes wide with a childlike terror, her hand clutched tightly in Julian's. "Mark?" she whimpered. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the agent's warning, and pulled her into my arms. "I'm here, Mom. It's okay. It was just a loud noise. It's over." Julian stood behind her, his face a mask of sweat and shame. He looked at me, then at the agents swarming our kitchen, and finally at the floor. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The silence between us was the heaviest thing in the room. The lead agent, a woman with a sharp bob and a weary expression, stepped into the center of the kitchen. She held up a small, clear evidence bag. Inside was a black hardware drive, the insurance policy Silas had been looking for. "Where did you find it?" I asked, my voice rasping. "Your brother had it taped to the underside of the basement freezer," she said, her eyes shifting to Julian. "He tried to claim he'd never seen it before, but the encryption matches the credentials of Sterling Tech. He's been carrying the keys to Thorne's Kingdom in his pocket since he left Manhattan." I looked at Julian. "You told them Dad had it. You told them it was in the walls." Julian swallowed, his eyes darting toward the window. "I needed them to stop shooting through the floor. I thought if they started looking in the walls, it would give the police time to arrive. I saw the sirens through the basement window, Mark. I knew they were coming." "You didn't know anything," the lead agent countered, her voice cold. "We've been tracking Silas since he crossed the state line. We were waiting for him to enter the residence so we could catch him with the extortion documents and the illegal firearms. Your brother didn't call us. Your neighbor did, when he saw the black SUV idling at your gate for 3 hours." I thought of old Mr. Henderson across the road, a man I'd shared a beer with every Friday for a decade. He'd done more to protect my family in 3 hours than Julian had in 5 years. "What happens now?" I asked. The agent sighed. "Silas and Thorne are going away for a long time. The evidence on this drive is enough to dismantle their entire operation. As for the house..." She looked at the manila envelope Silas had left on the table. "The forgery is clear. We'll need your statement, and Julian will be facing federal charges for fraud and money laundering. But given his cooperation, accidental as it was, the U.S. attorney might be inclined to offer a plea. The house is safe, Mark. The government has no interest in seizing a primary residence from a victim of forgery." Safe. The word felt hollow. I looked at the kitchen, the broken door, the scuff marks from tactical boots, the lingering smoke. The house was safe, but the home was gone. The agents took Julian away in a separate car. He didn't look back. He didn't ask to say goodbye to Mom. He just walked to the cruiser with his head down, a man who had finally run out of bridges to burn. I watched the red and blue lights fade into the morning mist, feeling a strange sense of mourning. I wasn't mourning my brother. I was mourning the memory of the person I thought he was. A month later, the dust had finally settled. The legal battles were exhausting, but the house remained ours. I had to take out a small loan to fix the damage and cover some of the legal fees, but the landscaping business was busier than ever. People in town had heard what happened, and in their own quiet way, they were looking out for us. Mom was sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. It was a good day. She remembered my name. She even remembered Dad's truck. "Mark?" she called out. I walked over and sat on the steps beside her. "Yeah, Mom." "That man," she said, her voice soft. "The one who was crying in the kitchen. Did he ever find what he was looking for?" I looked out at the long dirt driveway, the place where Julian had arrived in tatters and left in chains. I thought about the millions of dollars he'd made, the visionary titles he'd held, and the cold, empty silence of the life he'd chosen over us. "No, Mom," I said, reaching over to take her hand. "I don't think he ever did." My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a collect call from a correctional facility. I looked at the screen for a long time. I thought about the 5 years of silence. I thought about the photo of Mom sleeping in her bed. I thought about the man who had used our lives as a bargaining chip. I didn't answer. I didn't block the number either. I just let it ring and ring until the sound was swallowed by the chirping of the crickets and the rustle of the wind through the trees. Julian had spent years ignoring our calls because he thought he was above us. Now I was ignoring his because I finally knew where I belonged. I belonged here, on this porch, in this house, with the people who actually showed up when the world turned dark. I stood up, kissed my mother on the forehead, and went inside to finish the coffee. The pot was still there, a little stained, a little chipped, but it still worked. Just like us. Just like the house. We were still standing, and for the first time in 5 years, the silence in the kitchen didn't feel like a void. It felt like peace.